Hi, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here tonight in my hometown of Raleigh. I'd like to start off by thanking Quail Ridge Books for hosting the event tonight, as well as thanking everyone who came. And I know we have a lot of nurses in the audience tonight, so I wanted to give them a special thank you as well for coming. I'll begin by setting the stage for how the 30 Americans arrived in Albania, which is just across the Adriatic from Italy and north of Greece. I'll then discuss the daring rescue, read a small section from the book, share some photos, and we can end with any questions you may have. In early November 1943, 13 flight nurses and 13 flight medics boarded a C-53 transport plane with a 4-man flight crew. The nurses and medics were traveling from their headquarters on the island of Sicily to Bari, Italy in the north, where they were scheduled to pick up wounded and ill patients from near the front lines and transport them to more fully equipped hospitals around the Mediterranean. Bad weather had plagued the area for the past 3 days, and patients had piled up. Though the weather was sunny and clear when the plane took off that November day, the aircraft soon encountered a violent storm that pushed the plane off course. The flight crew managed to avoid dangerous waterspouts that formed around them, but they were disoriented by the weather, had lost communication with the station at Bari, their destination, and their instrument panel was malfunctioning. After several hours in the air and not realizing they'd crossed the Adriatic, they decided their best chance of survival was to land the plane. They saw an airfield with German planes that looked like they had been abandoned, as so many had during the war. But when they attempted to land, the plane suddenly came to life, and the Americans were under fire. The pilots quickly ascended the aircraft, only to find themselves in the path of 2 German fighter planes. The routine 2-hour flight had turned into a 5-hour journey, and the pilots were now dodging enemy planes without any weapons to defend themselves. They ducked in and out of clouds in an attempt to evade the fighter planes and eventually found a small patch of land near a lake and nestled between rugged mountains where they could land. As the plane careened along the ground, still saturated with water, the landing gear slowly sank in the mud until it was completely submerged. It brought the plane to a violent stop. The force embedded the plane's nose in the marshy land, and the fuselage hovered upright for a few seconds before falling to the ground in a belly flop. The crew chief, who was in the back of the plane and not buckled in as the other passengers were, was severely injured in the crash. The passengers tried to get their bearings and eventually exited the plane to find they were surrounded by rugged terrain. Within minutes, a group of rough-looking armed men dressed in homemade uniforms came out of the woods and surrounded them. This began the Americans' months-long journey in which they faced a barrage of life-threatening incidents, had very little food for weeks on end, and were forced to hide at night with villagers who were risking their lives to help them. During one German attack, which occurred within a week of the crash landing, 3 of the nurses were separated from the others in the group. Not knowing if the 3 women were alive or dead, the rest of the party had no choice but to wander through rugged terrain, tired, hungry, and ill, looking desperately for a way to escape. For weeks, they were led through one village after another by Albanian partisans who were members of a resistance group in Albania who found them food and shelter. At times, the Americans weren't sure they could trust these partisans who seemed to be using them as propaganda for their cause rather than helping them escape. Meanwhile, the Army Air Forces scrambled to find out what had happened to the missing plane and its passengers. The Army Air Forces sent out search planes throughout the Mediterranean, but there were no signs of them anywhere. The stranded Americans quickly learned that Albania was a small country about the size of Maryland, which had changed very little over the last several hundred years. German troops had occupied Albania after Italy surrendered to the Allies in September 1943, just 2 months before, and thousands of abandoned Italian troops, many of whom would not survive the brutal coming winter, still wandered the countryside. The Americans also learned that tensions between 2 Albanian resistance groups, the partisans and the Bali Komtar, had erupted into a civil war, and that was as much as a threat to them as were the Germans. After 22 days, the American men and women finally located a British officer who escorted them to his mission's camp. Though the Americans didn't know it at the time, the men at the camp worked for the Clandestine Special Operations Executive, or SOE, which was Churchill's secret army. SOE had been granted control over Albania in 1942 when OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which is the American equivalent, and SOE carved the world into zones that would be controlled by one or the other or shared by both. The majority of the British officers sent into Albania had received the same type of training as other SOE officers, but at SOE schools in the Middle East. Though the basic coursework remained the same as those taught in Britain, there were some specialty courses offered, such as skiing and climbing, and even mule management at a mountain warfare school in Lebanon. One officer found that the mule management class was the most useful course of the lot. Instead of being in disguise like other SOE officers working in other countries, these men wore uniforms that could withstand the harsh conditions of the mountain caves from which they operated guerrilla warfare. Some added local touches, including curly-toed slippers or fezzes, but battle dress was standard. The first handful of SOE men had arrived in April 1943 to help the two main resistance groups fight the Italians. But to the men's growing frustration, the resistance groups often seemed more interested in killing one another than anything else. By October 1943, a month before the Americans crash-landed, 24 British Special Operations men were in the country and organized into 7 small missions, all of which faced constant danger. Of the first 50 men sent into the country, 16 of them were eventually captured or killed. The British, who greeted the exhausted Americans, weary from 3 weeks of walking, soon contacted SOE headquarters in Cairo, who then relayed the information to American officials and the American OSS that the party was safe and in their care. OSS had sent its first men into Albania to assist the British just a few weeks earlier after setting up new headquarters in Bari, Italy, which is where the plane was originally headed. Having men in Albania allowed them to establish a vital communications link to Bari that would be critical in coordinating the desperate rescue mission now needed. OSS quickly devised a plan which involved sending in an officer to help get them out. That man would be 24-year-old OSS officer Lloyd Smith. Smith had been stationed in Egypt for almost a year and been promoted to captain when he was recruited by OSS in Cairo in early September 1943. An OSS recruiter promised Smith the excitement he craved, particularly because his brother Clayton was headed overseas to serve as a pilot on a B-26 bomber. Smith later wrote, "Unless I did something more exciting than ordnance, I would have trouble living with him when we got back home after the war." Soon after Smith arrived at OSS headquarters in Bari, Italy, his commanding officer said to him, "We have a priority job. How would you like to volunteer to go to Albania?" Though Smith knew little of the terrain or the language, he agreed to locate the stranded Americans and bring them to the coast for a sea evacuation with just a 3-hour briefing under his belt. Smith received his orders on November 30th, and by the evening of December 2nd, he had already made 2 attempts to cross the Adriatic by boat from Brindisi, another port city southeast of Bari. When his second attempt had been canceled that day because of the discovery of German mines in Brindisi's port, he decided to go back to the OSS office in Bari to wait until the area was cleared. He had just arrived when the Germans unleashed a massive air attack on the harbor just 3 blocks away that would later be known as the Second Pearl Harbor. Smith was fortunate not to be hurt. At least 1,000 people, including civilians, were killed. Countless people were injured, and 17 Allied ships were destroyed. On Smith's final attempt to reach the coast of Albania, he took a British motor fishing vessel under the cover of darkness and wearing the uniform of a captain in the AAF to help support his cover story as a downed pilot if the Germans captured him. The treatment of a prisoner of war was far better than that of a spy, particularly with Hitler's commando order in place. The order demanded that all Allied men caught behind enemy lines be killed immediately, a policy that violated international law. In charge of Smith's boat was Lieutenant Jack Taylor, a former dentist from California with the United States Navy Reserve, who also served as chief of OSS Maritime Unit in Bari. Taylor was not only secretly delivering Smith into the Nazi-occupied country, he was also bringing in desperately needed supplies, some of which eventually landed in the hands of the Americans. Around 11 that evening, the captain was able to safely anchor a half-mile off the Albanian coast, and the crew rowed Smith and the supplies to the narrow shore. With the black shadows of mountains looming over him, Smith hiked some 800 feet up a switchback trail to reach Seaview, the series of caves overlooking the Adriatic that allowed SOE and OSS to deliver and evacuate personnel, bring weapons and supplies into the country, and pass on intelligence material. Filled with lice and black scorpions, Seaview was the temporary home of several SOE personnel. An officer with MI6, Britain's secret